Colleagues mocked the young orderly for becoming attached to a lonely, elderly lady. Tom was just like any other 4-year-old born into a middle-class family. He was the happiness in his parents' lives. He was loved, protected, and cared for, like any parent would do for their kid. He had everything he wished for and was living life to the fullest, with hopes of someday growing into the man of his dreams and making his parents proud. However, his dream did not somehow align with his fate. Before he turned 5, he experienced the most traumatic event of his life. The death of his parents tested him to the limits of his endurance. It was obvious the incident would leave an indelible mark on his life. His fate put him in a direction no one saw coming. It was the opposite of what he was accustomed to do. Also, if you've not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now back to the story. After the death of his parents and with no relative to take care of him, he was sent to the orphanage. Tom, like every newcomer to the orphanage, felt abandoned, angry, and especially frightened at the thought of having to spend the rest of his life in a strange and lonely place without his parents, whom he loved and missed. The children who had been there earlier didn't really like the newcomers like Tom, as they reflected on the scarcity of supplies at the orphanage. They believed that somehow, if the orphanage stopped bringing in homeless people, there would be enough food, love, and support for them. They also played by a different set of rules. During Tom's initial days at the orphanage, he was bullied by the older boys because he was always moody and crying. Each time he sensed what mischief the boys were up to, he took solace in the company of Mrs. Morris, an elderly woman who worked in the orphanage as a cleaner. Mrs. Morris was a compassionate and kind woman who loved all the children in the orphanage. She was like a grandmother to them, and the children loved her so much. She often brought toffees for the younger kids and sometimes for the older kids. She took interest in the upbringing of Tom, as he was one of the youngest in the orphanage and was bullied often. She would always give Tom sweets and ice cream after lunch, but made sure the other kids never noticed. Tom loved Mrs. Morris like his grandmother. After a while, Mrs. Morris felt ill and passed away. Tom was heartbroken once again. The only person he felt happy calling family was dead, and he was left in the world all by himself once again. He loved to read comic books and wished he could become a modern-day superhero and save the lives of others. Tom grew up to be a gentle and kind boy. Some years later, Tom graduated from high school and was admitted to a medical college where he hoped to graduate as a doctor. To him, being a doctor was the perfect job for him to be able to save the lives of others, as he had always wanted to do since childhood. While he was enrolled full-time as a student, he worked part-time at a nearby hospital as an orderly. As much as he needed the money, he also wanted to be familiar with the hospital environment, as he was optimistic he would one day end up there. In his work, he sometimes assisted parents with the location of various facilities and departments and gave company to lonely patients. While working there, he grew attached to an elderly woman named Mrs. Brown. She always reminded him of his sweet, loving Mrs. Morris from the orphanage. This made Tom develop a natural sense of responsibility towards Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown had been admitted to the hospital for more than 2 months, but had yet to receive a visitor. As Tom got more and more familiar with Mrs. Brown, he learned that she had no relatives, and just like him, she had lost the 2 people that mattered to her most in her life, her husband and son. Mrs. Brown's plight was perfectly understood by Tom, who quickly gave her a hug and assured her he would always be around to support her. One day, Mrs. Brown observed Tom helping an elderly lady who was struggling to make it to the exit in her wheelchair. She soon realized that Tom did such kind acts on a daily basis. She was touched by his actions and inquired as to what motivated him. This led to Tom sharing his life story with Mrs. Brown, who came to appreciate Tom more. Tom believed care and warmth could prolong one's life, and so he treated everyone he came into contact with, especially older people, with love and sympathy. As Tom kept living each day with compassion towards the elderly at the hospital, his classmates from the medical school chanced on him. To him, it was nothing to be teased about, but to his colleagues, they had found a laughingstock for the rest of the semester. They began making fun of him by claiming he had an 80-year-old girlfriend. Soon, there were controversies about Tom dating Mrs. Brown simply because she had no relatives and he was likely to inherit all her wealth when she dies. At first, he wasn't bothered in the least, but he knew the joke had gone too far when it was said in the presence of Mrs. Brown. She didn't react to what she heard because there was no truth in what was said. She looked forward to seeing Tom and advising him not to let their lies ever get in the way of the good he had dedicated his life to. Tom, on the other hand, became so furious he decided to take a week off of work. After a while, he realized he had been irrational in letting their mockery get to him. He resumed work as soon as possible and tried to apologize to Mrs. Brown on behalf of his colleagues who started the joke. As he was waiting for the fabricated controversy about him to die off, he was approached by a young and beautiful classmate named Sharon, who angrily accused him of being a disgrace to their honorable medical school. Tom clearly wasn't expecting that level of accusation, so he was dumbfounded until Sharon walked away. The truth is, when she heard that Tom was dating an 80-year-old, she was jealous because she really admired Tom and had decided to befriend him. But when she later heard about the fabricated motive of his relationship, she felt appalled and decided to confront Tom. So her confrontation was a result of disappointment and jealousy. Tom suffered from an inferiority complex and never thought a girl as beautiful as Sharon would like him. He was so focused on achieving his dream as a doctor that everything he did played a role in making his dream a reality. One day, Tom finished his work at the hospital, and as usual, he went to check on Mrs. Brown. To his surprise, Mrs. Brown wasn't in her room. He searched the entire hospital but couldn't find her. His first thought was that Mrs. Brown had been discharged and had gone home, but he wasn't sure if Mrs. Brown would leave without saying goodbye. He couldn't get his mind to rest, so he inquired from one of the nurses, who told him Mrs. Brown died from a heart failure the previous night. His worst fear had come true. Yet again, he had lost someone who was dear to his heart. Tears streamed from Tom's eyes, but he didn't even try to wipe them away. He was alone again. He began to wonder if those he held dear to his heart were bound to die after a while. He immediately remembered that Mrs. Brown had no relatives, and he instantly decided to give the woman a decent burial. He used all of his savings to finance the burial, which was attended by 2 people. As he stood over Mrs. Brown's tomb, he began to reminisce about the good but short time they had spent together, the stories they told each other, and the advice he often got from her. With tears rolling down his cheeks, he really mourned her death. As he paid his last respects to Mrs. Brown, he felt a pat on his shoulder. He slowly turned around, and to his utmost surprise, it was Sharon. He looked confused since no one knew what he was up to. Sharon had actually come to apologize for judging him wrongly and harshly. She now realized how much of a kind and compassionate soul Tom was. She offered her condolences and held Tom's hand as they both stared at Mrs. Brown's tomb. Tom and Sharon became good friends, and afterwards, when they both graduated, they openly confessed their feelings for each other. They both wanted to get married on the spur of the moment, even though they weren't financially ready. They ditched the idea of a fancy wedding, and right after their court marriage, celebrated the special day in the comfort of their home with a bottle of champagne and a large platter of cake. While enjoying their moment, they heard their alarm bell go off. They were both surprised as they weren't expecting any guests. It was the postman at the door. Tom got curious as to who would send him a letter by mail, as he had no relatives and barely any friends. When he saw that the sender was Mrs. Brown, his eyes were filled with tears. What he didn't know was that the night before Mrs. Brown passed away, she wrote a letter and instructed that the letter be sent to Tom after 6 months. In the letter, she thanked Tom for making her last days on Earth memorable and worthwhile. She urged him to continue living his life with compassion and love. She also bequeathed all her possessions, which included a 2-story building apartment and a huge bank balance, to Tom. She trusted that Tom would make good use of her possessions and would make her proud, just like the son she had. The couple couldn't believe what they had just read. At first, it felt unreal, but they couldn't hide their joy. With such a fortune in their possession, Tom came up with an idea. Having realized how much care and attention older people needed, the couple decided to sell the two-story building. He used the proceeds to construct a private retirement home. He built the safe haven every old person could only dream of. He had always believed quality care and attention had the power to prolong one's life, and had built an establishment that operated on that philosophy. If you enjoyed the video, kindly give it a thumbs up, leave a comment in the comment section, and share with others. Thanks for watching, and catch you in the next one.